Imagine a country so small it fits inside the state of Maine. A country with no river, no farmland, and almost no rain. A country that, just 60 years ago, had barely any paved roads and no written constitution. Now imagine that same tiny country walking into a room with the most powerful nation on earth and placing $100 billion on the table like a chess piece. Not as a gift, not as charity, not even as friendship. As a move. A calculated, patient, history-making move. And underneath that move is a question so consequential, so far-reaching, that the answer could change how every single country on this planet does business for the next 100 years. The question is this: does the world still need the American dollar? That question used to be almost too dangerous to ask out loud. Governments that raised it found themselves isolated. Economists who wrote about it too loudly found their work dismissed as fringe. Leaders who moved against the dollar found themselves facing the full force of American financial retaliation. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency for oil sales. He is gone. Saddam Hussein switched Iraq's oil sales to euros in 2000. Within 3 years, American tanks were in Baghdad. The petrodollar was not just a financial system. It was an enforced system, a system with consequences for those who challenged it. Today, the United Arab Emirates is not just asking whether the world still needs the dollar, they are answering it. And the answer they are giving is shaking the foundations of the entire global financial system. To understand what is really happening, you cannot start in 2025. You have to go back, way back, to 1973. Because 1973 is when everything that is unraveling today was first put together. That year, the United States was in trouble. The Vietnam War had drained the Treasury, inflation was rising. And just 2 years earlier, President Nixon had done something that terrified the world's financial system. He ended the gold standard. For nearly 3 decades, every US dollar had been backed by gold. You could, in theory, walk into an American bank and exchange your paper dollars for actual gold at a fixed price. When Nixon ended that, he pulled the rug out from under the global monetary system. Suddenly, the dollar was just paper, backed by nothing but the word of the US government. The world was nervous. The dollar's dominance looked like it could be slipping. And then came the deal that saved it. The deal that nobody voted on, nobody debated in public, and that most people alive today have never even heard of. In 1974, the United States struck a secret agreement with Saudi Arabia. The terms were stark and simple. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in American dollars. Every barrel, every shipment, every transaction. Dollars only. In exchange, the United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi royal family with its military might. Other oil-producing nations followed. Kuwait, the UAE. The entire OPEC alliance eventually aligned around dollar-denominated oil. Within a few years, this system had a name, the petrodollar. And it was not just a financial arrangement, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. Because it meant that every country in the world, every factory in Germany, every shipping company in Japan, every power plant in India, had to first acquire American dollars before they could purchase the oil they needed to keep their lights on and their economies running. The whole world became structurally dependent on the dollar, not by force, not by threat, but by economic reality. Oil is not optional, and oil cost dollars. So dollars were not optional either. That one deal, made in a desert between an American Treasury Secretary and a Saudi king, gave the United States a financial superpower that no empire in all of human history had ever possessed. For 50 years, that system held. Countries stockpiled dollars in their central banks. They purchased U.S. Treasury bonds with their export revenues. They essentially lent money to America at low interest rates, funding American spending, American infrastructure, American military operations. Bloomberg Economics later calculated that just between 2005 and 2023, the flow of Gulf oil money into U.S. debt markets saved American taxpayers approximately $700 billion in borrowing costs alone. $700 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is the equivalent of funding the entire U.S. defense budget for a year, plus change. The petrodollar was not just a currency arrangement, it was the financial engine that powered American global dominance for half a century. And the Gulf states, including the UAE, were the ones keeping that engine fueled. But something has changed, something fundamental. And the people who should be paying the closest attention are only now beginning to wake up to what is happening. The United Arab Emirates is a federation of 7 emirates. The most powerful of them, Abu Dhabi, sits on one of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. For decades, Abu Dhabi played the role America wrote for it. It sold oil in dollars. It invested its surpluses in U.S. treasuries and Western financial institutions. It allowed American military bases on its soil. It was a loyal, quiet, and extraordinarily wealthy partner in the petrodollar system. Today, something has shifted in that relationship. The UAE is still America's partner, but it is no longer only America's partner. And the difference between those two sentences is the entire story. In January 2024, the United Arab Emirates formally joined BRICS. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what BRICS actually is today. It began in 2001 as a concept invented by a Goldman Sachs economist, a shorthand label for the fast-growing economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. For years, it was mostly a talking club. Nations met, issued statements, and went home. But something changed after 2022, when the United States and its allies froze more than $300 billion in Russian foreign exchange reserves following the invasion of Ukraine. The moment was a turning point, not just for Russia, for every country in the world that was watching, because it proved something that many had suspected but never fully accepted. The dollar system could be weaponized. The reserves that countries held in dollars, in Western banks, and U.S. treasuries, those reserves were not simply savings. They were hostages. America could freeze them. America could block access to the SWIFT payment system. America could cut a country off from the global dollar economy overnight. After 2022, the question was not just about diversification. It was about survival. And BRICS suddenly became the most serious alternative platform the world had available. By 2024, BRICS had expanded to 10 full members, including significantly the UAE and Iran and Egypt, countries with a combined economic weight that now rivals the G7 on several measures. The UAE's decision to join was not impulsive. It was calculated. It came after years of watching, waiting, and positioning. Abu Dhabi's rulers are not ideologues. They do not hate America. They do not want to see the West collapse. What they want, above all else, is autonomy, security, options. And BRICS in 2024 offered the most credible and largest coalition of countries pursuing exactly that goal. The UAE joining BRICS was not a divorce from America. It was a prenuptial agreement, a document that quietly, politely, but unmistakably says, we can leave if we need to. And that message sent a signal to Washington that was politely worded, but unmistakably clear. At nearly the same time the UAE was stepping into BRICS, it was also helping to quietly construct a new financial infrastructure. A parallel system running beneath the dollar economy, designed not necessarily to destroy the dollar, but to create options where none existed before. This project is called mBridge, and outside of a small circle of central bankers and financial analysts, almost nobody is talking about it at the level of detail it deserves. mBridge is a wholesale central bank digital currency platform. Here is the simple version. When countries trade with each other today, most transactions flow through a system dominated by the US dollar and a banking messaging network called SWIFT. SWIFT is essentially the language that banks use to talk to each other internationally. The United States and its allies have used SWIFT as a financial weapon, cutting off Iran, cutting off Russia, threatening to cut off others. mBridge is being built to replace all of that. The central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates began developing this platform together in 2021. Saudi Arabia joined as a full member in 2024. The concept is elegant. Instead of routing payments through dollar-denominated correspondent banks and SWIFT, countries can settle international trades directly using digital currencies issued by their own central banks. No intermediary, no dollar conversion, no American visibility into the transaction, no exposure to American sanctions. In June 2024, mBridge announced it had reached what the financial community calls minimum viable product status, which means it works, it is functional, it is real, and it is ready for real-world use. Real money, real transactions, real settlements across borders without a single dollar changing hands and without a single American bank involved in the process. Then came a stunning moment in October 2024. The Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of all central banks, essentially the most elite and cautious financial institution on earth, formally withdrew from the project and handed it entirely to the member central banks to operate independently. The BIS issued a statement saying it had done its part. The platform was viable. What that withdrawal actually signaled, beneath the careful institutional language, was something far more significant. mBridge had matured beyond the experimental phase. It was not a pilot anymore. It was an operational system, a functioning alternative to the dollar-based payment infrastructure that has governed global trade for 50 years. And the UAE is not just using it. The UAE's central bank helped design it, tested it, and now helps run it. The UAE is one of the engineers of the exit door from the Petrodollar system, while simultaneously being one of the Petrodollar system's most important participants. Hold that image, because it tells you everything about how the UAE thinks. Let us sit with that for a moment. The UAE is simultaneously a close military ally of the United States, a host to American military forces, a massive buyer of American weapon systems, one of the largest investors in American real estate and financial markets, and a co-builder of a financial system explicitly designed to route around American financial oversight. That is not a contradiction to the UAE. That is strategy. That is the new playbook of a middle power that has learned to play multiple tables at once. And it is working. Now let us talk about oil, Because oil is where this all started, and oil is where the most dramatic numbers are emerging. For decades, nearly 100% of the world's oil was traded in American dollars. Then that number started moving, slowly at first, then faster. By 2023, approximately 1/5 of all global oil trades were being conducted in currencies other than the US dollar. 1 in 5 barrels. That is a number that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. In March 2023, the UAE made a move that was small in scale but enormous in symbolism. It completed the sale of its first liquefied natural gas cargo to China, paid for entirely in Chinese yuan, not dollars, yuan. A Gulf state, a founding member of the Petrodollar system, selling energy in a competing currency to the world's largest buyer of oil and gas. The transaction was quiet, almost unreported in the Western financial press. But every central bank that monitors global currency flows noticed. And what they noticed was that the dam, the 50-year dam that had kept nearly all oil trade locked in dollars, had developed its first real crack. The UAE's ability to do this, to sell in yuan, to join BRICS, to build Enbridge, did not come from nowhere. It came from 50 years of extraordinary wealth accumulation and increasingly sophisticated economic diversification. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund, known as the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, manages assets estimated at over $800 billion. It is one of the top 5 sovereign wealth funds on Earth. Dubai International Financial Center has grown into one of the world's most active financial hubs, hosting thousands of global corporations. The UAE trades with over 200 countries and territories. Its container ports handle shipping lanes that connect Asia, Africa, and Europe. Its airlines connect the entire globe through Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Its tourism industry generated over $50 billion in 2024. Non-oil sectors now account for more than 70% of the UAE's GDP, a figure that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. The UAE today is not a one-trick petrostate. It is a diversified financial power with connections running through every major economy in the world. That diversification is precisely what gives the UAE the confidence to make the moves it is making. When you have options, you do not have to beg. And the UAE increasingly does not beg. It bargains. And when it bargains, the whole world listens. Which brings us to 2025, and the deal that put this entire story on the front pages of the world's financial press. In May 2025, President Donald Trump flew to Abu Dhabi on the final leg of his Gulf tour. The reception he received was one of the most elaborate diplomatic welcomes in the UAE's history. Fighter jet escorts, massive crowds, state banquets, and at the center of it all, a deal that analysts are still trying to fully process. The headline number was a pledge of $1.4 trillion in UAE investment into the United States over the next 10 years. The number was staggering. For reference, the UAE's entire gross domestic product in 2024 was approximately $540 billion. They were pledging more than double their annual economic output as a 10-year investment commitment. Analysts and fact-checkers were immediately skeptical. CNN noted the figure was over twice the UAE's GDP. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace described Gulf investment pledges of this size as often flimsier than they appear, noting they frequently include projects already underway and projections that regularly fail to materialize. The Atlantic Council similarly flagged that headline investment numbers from Gulf deals routinely contained commitments that were happening anyway, repackaged with new timestamps for diplomatic purposes. But within that enormous, somewhat theatrical headline number, there's a specific figure that is entirely real, immediately actionable, and strategically loaded. $100 billion, designated specifically for mobilizing investment around American leadership in artificial intelligence, with UAE-backed investment firm MGX, Microsoft, BlackRock, and global infrastructure partners all explicitly named as participants. This is not a vague aspiration. This is a named coalition with named amounts moving toward a named strategic priority. And the price of that commitment, the thing the UAE was asking for in return, was something America had refused to provide for years. The world's most advanced AI semiconductors, NVIDIA's most powerful chips, the hardware that determines who wins the global race to build artificial intelligence. For years, both the Biden administration and congressional leaders from both parties had blocked the export of advanced AI chips to the UAE. The concern was bipartisan, specific, and serious. U.S. intelligence agencies and technology policy experts warned consistently that Gulf states, particularly the UAE, had deep technology partnerships with Chinese companies that could create pathways for advanced American chips to end up in Chinese military systems. The UAE-based technology company G42, for example, was flagged by American intelligence as having potential ties to Chinese military-linked operations. The Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee had called for an investigation. Democrats raised alarm. In May 2025, Trump announced in Abu Dhabi that the UAE would receive access to up to 500,000 NVIDIA AI chips annually under a framework worth approximately $10 billion. Months later, Microsoft confirmed it had received a U.S. Commerce Department export licenses to ship more than 60,000 of NVIDIA's cutting-edge GB300 Grace Blackwell chips, among the most powerful computational hardware ever produced, directly to UAE data centers. The deal bypassed the Biden-era AI diffusion rules that had restricted these exports. The Trump administration moved to rescind those rules entirely. Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's CEO, called the UAE deal critical to staying ahead of China in the AI race. National security experts across the political spectrum called it reckless. And then came the detail that turned a complicated geopolitical story into something even more extraordinary. 4 days before Trump's inauguration in January 2025, lieutenants to Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the UAE's national security advisor, brother to the UAE's president, and the man personally driving the UAE's AI ambitions, quietly signed a deal to purchase a 49% stake in World Liberty Financial. World Liberty Financial is a cryptocurrency company co-founded by members of the Trump family and the family of Steve Witkoff, who weeks later was named U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East. The price of that stake? $500 million. Of that amount, at least $187 million flowed directly to Trump family entities. At least $31 million was slated for entities affiliated with the Witkoff family. The deal was not disclosed publicly. Investigative journalists uncovered it months later. The New York Times interviewed more than 75 people in a comprehensive investigation. The White House denied any connection between the private investment and the public chip export decision. But the Wall Street Journal reported that the investment was explicitly backed by Sheikh Tahnoun, the same man who had been pressing America for access to the AI chips. Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen described the situation as a foreign country bribing the president. Independent legal and ethics experts told the Times that the back-to-back deals violated long-standing norms in American political and diplomatic practice in ways without known precedent. This is not a clean story. The UAE-America relationship in 2025 is not a simple alliance or a simple rivalry. It is something far messier and far more interesting. It is a relationship between an irreplaceable partner and a rising challenger, between a patron and a client who no longer accepts the word client, between a financial superpower and a smaller nation that has learned, patiently, methodically, and at enormous cost, how to make itself indispensable enough that the superpower cannot afford to push back too hard. Now pull the camera back and look at the broader picture. Because the UAE is not alone in what it is doing. It is the most visible, most active, and most strategically sophisticated actor in a broader global shift. But that shift has many participants, and each of them adds weight to what the UAE is building. The dollar's share of global central bank reserves has fallen from over 70% 2 decades ago to approximately 56% today. That is still the largest share of any single currency by a significant margin. The dollar is still the undisputed number one. But the trend line is unmistakable, and it is not reversing. The Chinese yuan has grown its share of global reserves, though it still sits at less than 5%, illustrating both the ambition of de-dollarization and its current limits. China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, now connects over 4,800 banks across 185 countries, offering a dollar-free alternative to SWIFT for yuan-denominated transactions. The number of countries using CIPS grew by nearly 40% in just the last 3 years. Russia and China now conduct the overwhelming majority of their bilateral trade in their own currencies, completely bypassing the dollar. Brazil and China signed a direct yuan-real currency swap agreement in 2023, routing massive volumes of trade away from dollar intermediaries. India has been purchasing Russian oil in rupees, developing an entirely new settlement architecture to make that possible. Saudi Arabia, which is not yet a full BRICS member but has joined Enbridge and is openly discussing yuan-denominated oil pricing, is perhaps the single biggest wildcard in the entire petrodollar story. If the kingdom that started the petrodollar system in 1974 ever formally moves away from dollar-only oil pricing, the consequences would be seismic. That moment has not arrived, but the conversations happening in Riyadh today would have been absolutely unthinkable 10 years ago. BRICS nations are testing a digital gold-backed settlement unit called simply the Unit. A pilot launched in October 2025, aimed at giving member nations a neutral settlement tool that sidesteps both the dollar and the yuan, backed by a basket of member currencies and gold reserves. BRICS central banks collectively purchased more than half of all gold sold globally between 2020 and 2024, systematically converting dollar-denominated reserves into physical assets that no American president can freeze, no American court can seize, and no SWIFT disconnection can touch. The combined gold reserves of BRICS member states now exceed 6,000 tons. That gold is not sitting in vaults as an investment. It is sitting there as insurance, as a hedge against the financial weapon that America used against Russia in 2022, and that every watching nation knows could theoretically be used against them too. Trump's response to these moves has been direct. He warned that any country attempting to bypass the dollar in international trade would face a 100% tariff on their exports to the United States. The threat has real teeth. America's consumer market is still the largest and most desirable in the world. Access to it is worth enormous concessions. But the threat also has limits. You cannot tariff a country into staying in a financial system. And the countries building the alternative infrastructure are doing so precisely because they have watched what happened when America weaponized financial access against Russia. And they have decided they want a backup plan. Not tomorrow, over the next decade. Quietly, patiently, one digital currency pilot and one yuan-denominated LNG cargo at a time. History, again, is instructive. The British pound sterling was the world's dominant reserve currency for much of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. In 1948, the pound accounted for roughly twice the global reserve share of the US dollar. By 1969, the dollar had overtaken the pound by a factor of 10 to 1. By 1980, the pound represented just 2% of global reserves. The British did not lose their currency's status in a single dramatic collapse. They lost it through accumulated pressures, through the costs of 2 world wars, through the rise of a newer and more dynamic economic power, and through the failure to adapt fast enough to a world that was changing around them. The fall of the pound was gradual, then sudden. The economists who tracked it in real time consistently underestimated how fast the final phase would move. Nobody's predicting the dollar disappears tomorrow. The dollar is backed by the deepest and most liquid financial markets on Earth. It is backed by the most powerful military in history. It is backed by institutional trust built over decades that cannot be replicated overnight. SWIFT handles $150 trillion in transactions annually. Bridge, for all its promise, is still tiny compared to the existing system. The dollar is not going anywhere fast. The Atlantic Council, not a radical institution, not prone to sensationalism, has said clearly that the dollar's dominance will remain in the foreseeable future. That assessment is credible and worth taking seriously. The dollar has survived previous predictions of its decline. It will likely survive many more challenges before any genuine shift in global reserve currency status takes place. The structural advantages the dollar holds, American legal institutions, the depth of U.S. Treasury markets, the dollar's role in pricing commodities from oil to wheat to copper, are not dissolving quickly. They may take a generation to meaningfully erode. They may take 2. But here is what is categorically different today compared to every previous era when people predicted the dollar's decline. In every previous moment, the countries pushing for alternatives did not have real tools. They had rhetoric. They had ambitions. They did not have working infrastructure. Today, for the first time in history, the infrastructure is being built in earnest. Bridge is not a conference room idea anymore. CIPS is not a wish list. The BRICS unit is not a white paper. These are functioning, tested, and expanding systems. The plumbing of an alternative to dollar dominance is under active construction, and the UAE is one of the most skilled plumbers on the job. But here's the thing that makes the UAE's story so historically important. The UAE is not trying to end the dollar. The UAE is not trying to dethrone America. What the UAE is doing is something far more subtle and far more powerful. It is building optionality. It is building a world in which the UAE, and every nation watching what the UAE is doing, has choices. More than one currency for their oil. More than one payment system for their trade. More than one alliance for their geopolitical alignment. The UAE is not replacing the dollar with the yuan. It is building a world where both options exist, where it can pick and choose based on the deal in front of it, based on who is offering the better terms, based on what serves Abu Dhabi's national interest in that specific moment. That optionality is a form of power that Gulf states have never held before. And once you build it, once you create real alternatives to a system that used to be unavoidable, you fundamentally change the terms of every negotiation you ever have with that system again. That is the real meaning of the $100 billion ultimatum. The money itself is almost secondary. Money, in this context, is the language of communication. What the UAE is really placing on the table, alongside those $100 billion, is the implicit reminder, quiet but unmistakable, that it also has other tables, that it is also sitting at the BRICS table, that it is also building Bridge, that it has already started selling gas in yuan, that it has already joined the global gold buying wave, that it has already started building data infrastructure, digital currency capacity, and financial alliances that do not run through Washington. The $100 billion is the carrot. The rest, Bridge, BRICS, UN-denominated LNG, the gold reserves, the tech investments in Shenzhen and Shanghai, is the context that makes the carrot matter so much. Together, this package says something very specific to Washington. Partner with us on genuinely favorable terms, because we now have genuinely favorable options if you choose not to. That sentence, said quietly, said diplomatically, said through the language of investment pledges and trade deals rather than confrontation, is the most powerful thing the UAE has ever communicated to the United States. And Washington heard it. Clearly. The proof is in the chip deal, a strategic concession that 2 consecutive administrations firmly refused to make, granted within months of the arrival of the largest Gulf investment pledges in recent American history. Washington heard that message. The proof is in the chip deal, a concession that 2 administrations refused to make, granted within months of the largest Gulf investment pledges in history. Whether that concession was wise is a question that will be debated by security analysts for years. Whether it was effective, for the UAE, is much easier to answer. They got what they wanted. They got the chips, they kept their BRICS membership, they kept Enbridge, they kept their yuan-denominated energy sales, they kept their relationships with China and with Russia. They got everything, and they gave up nothing structural. That is not diplomacy. That is mastery. The petrodollar system has survived oil shocks, financial crises, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the euro, and decades of warning signals. It is deeply embedded, deeply trusted, and backed by an institutional infrastructure that has no equal on Earth. It is not ending this year. Probably not this decade. But it is bending. It is bending in ways that have never happened before. And the country doing the most to bend it, while simultaneously writing the biggest checks to keep the relationship functional, is the United Arab Emirates, a country with no rivers, no forests, almost no rain, and an absolutely extraordinary capacity to turn limitation into leverage. The world is watching. The lesson the UAE is teaching about how a middle power can use wealth, geography, and strategic patience to rewrite its relationship with the world's dominant financial order is a lesson that dozens of other countries are studying right now. That lesson, above all, is this. The petrodollar system is not permanent. The dollar's dominance is not guaranteed forever. The door to an alternative financial architecture is open, even if just a crack, and it will not close again. And the country that opened that door wider than anyone thought possible, from inside the very system it is quietly helping to transform, was a tiny nation on a Gulf coast that the world once barely knew existed. The $100 billion ultimatum is on the table. The chips, literal and figurative, are in motion. And the game being played is one whose outcome will shape how money, power, and energy flow across this planet for the next generation. Pay attention. Because what happens next in this story is going to matter to every single one of us, no matter what currency we happen to be holding.